We are in fact live, so thank you. I just want to welcome you all to this Q&A of For No Fear, No Favor at the 29th Woods Hole Film Festival. The festival runs from now through midnight on August 3rd. So that is a new date. We have extended our festival. So you heard it here first, that we have extended the festival. But before we begin, I'd just like to thank you all, just all the festival supporters and sponsors. This festival is made possible by the assistance and support of so many people. And we do have hope that we'll be able to return next year in full capacity going forward. And we will continue to develop our virtual screening platform as well. Just a couple of housekeeping things. The audience can ask questions, just raise your hand or just put a comment in the comment box or the chat box, and we'll be sure to answer your questions. So just to get started, I just wanted to introduce our filmmakers here. We have Maxwell Anderson, as well as Mirra and Richard Bank. And I recently just finished watching your film, so I apologize that I just hopped in here. But it was so it was beautifully shot. It was, like I said to you earlier, quite moving. And it really is kind of poignant for the times that we're living in right now, as it really shows just how interconnected we all are for better or worse. And it just was, to me, so just relevant in, you know, because we're here in Woods Hole, and it's like, okay, well, we're highly aware just growing up in this area, like I did, of, you know, our natural resources and our environment, and it's you know, it's part of just how we grow up here. And it was just so interesting to see that it's like this new way of thinking is becoming the way of change for a better future. So I was just wondering if you could all speak a little bit on that, and then just maybe move on to how you even came to make this film.
Well, I'll say something quickly about this idea of the interconnectedness, and then maybe Richard will talk about how we came to make it, and Max will talk about the difficulties of editing it. But one of the things that is true about COVID-19, among other things, is that that's also about being interconnected. And so, because we have been very involved with certain groups like the Nature Conservancy that are really committed to preserving the earth as an entire ecosystem. And since we were able to spend some time partly working with them, but really on our own in Africa, we were very interested in this problem of poaching and the crashing, really, of species in Africa. And one of the things that we're unfamiliar with in this country is the idea of community conservancies. And quite honestly, it wasn't until we had been filming for a while that I understood that that truly was what the film had to bring forward. So the film deals with the problem of poaching, it deals with problems of poverty, it deals with rural communities. But the real story is that when humans protect the animals in these environments, when they receive benefit from them, tourism, education, jobs, livelihoods, everything thrives. And that is the best defense against poaching. So when the communities are the caretakers of their own resource, all kinds of things are possible. And when they're not able to do that, it's wide open for destruction. And how we got there, Richard?
One thing I think most people understand is that it's not easy to travel in Africa, nor is it inexpensive to travel in Africa for all kinds of reasons. And sort of our introduction was I was invited to speak in Cape Town. And so that was kind of a wonderful foothold in terms of just getting there. And then our connection to the Nature Conservancy here in New York, which translated to our connection to the Nature Conservancy. We'd asked what was happening what was the Nature Conservancy doing in South Africa? And they said they didn't have an office, but they had a brand new office in Zambia. And so we contacted them, and it was extremely fortunate that we got to actually travel with one of the three people that comprised the Zambian office, Robin Pope. And he was an extraordinary guide for us, at least in the beginning, in terms of just understanding what we were doing, what we were seeing, where we were going, how to get around. And that was just a wonderful opportunity and introduction to conservation in Zambia.
But I'll just jump in again quickly and thank you for the comments about the shooting. I shot the film, and we were a sort of two-person crew on 5 or 6 different trips. And this film came together over time and in a kind of experiential way, which is what Max had to deal with. So
I feel like you're setting me up. Yeah, I mean, it was a challenge to not just, I mean, the nature and the environment and being transported to how these people are living in poverty, and the struggles that we deal with, that we see those people deal with, both in terms of just the local people who live there and the conservationists who are trying to do their job. That's a compelling story, but it needs to be wrapped in a narrative in some way. And so that was a challenge. I mean, I could get into all the details, but I just think, to me, the takeaway was that narrative is so important. And so it was interesting from my perspective as an American, maybe even a little unexpected, that one thing that revealed itself was that the people who lived there didn't necessarily grow up with the narrative, a cultural narrative of the sort of unification with nature and the interconnectedness with nature. They were trying to survive. They were struggling to make, to put food on the table and to thrive in this environment. And that sometimes made them adversaries of the nature, which was also trying to survive. So that was just an interesting thing, and it's not necessarily something that we always think of as Americans or outsiders. We might have a picture of harmony with nature and it's all wonderful. I mean, not wonderful, but the idea of harmony we might just presume is innate there, and it just really isn't. And so I think that's something that Mirra and Richard really brought, and I hope that this film does, is tell that narrative and show us that that should be the story.
And it does. And it, it's the point where, it starts to show, how much work the conservancies are doing with education. That's really where that shift is happening, and a shift towards a hopeful future for younger generations coming. So, that part of it was just so, the topic itself is very heavy, and you get to that point, you're like, okay, here's the shift. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit on that, and just how those programs are coming about, or how you found out about them, and just about the relationships that you had to make to be able to tell this story. Just, you were touching on that a little bit as well, Maxwell.
Well, again, it was an experiential process, and it came about because ultimately the film was shot in 3 different countries, mostly in Zambia, but also in Namibia and in Kenya. And we were there for different reasons, different kinds of work, which allowed me to keep pursuing this storyline, because each of those countries is in sub-Saharan Africa, or in the part of Africa where wildlife is an increasingly relevant part of the economies of these countries, because without ecotourism, things would look very different. And in fact, that's one outcome, sad outcome of COVID, is that everything is threatened by the fact that people can't travel there anymore. So in those 3 countries, Kenya is the one, well, Namibia is the one that has the most highly developed, most baked in community conservancy program. Kenya is further along on that path, and Zambia is much less so. So we were able to see in Zambia the kind of struggle, the nascent desire to be able to do this. So that long community meeting where ultimately they discover that their resource, their most immediate resource is teak, is the payoff at the end for them. But in other stories, you discover the way that taking care of an animal for the man who takes care of Suni, the baby elephant that ultimately dies, changes his life. And then he becomes the one who wants to teach or to train or to do outreach with others. And I think the answer about how these programs come about is that it's different in every country. It has to do with how supportive the governments are, how successful the NGOs in those particular countries are, and how far along the sort of relationship between tourism and conservation has evolved, because it is different in every country. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's a terrific problem because it's high stakes, and we're playing for time here. Time is not on our side, everybody's not starting out on the same footing. It really is a different situation, country to country. And it often depends on how corrupt their governments are, how many internal, how many civil wars there have been, or, violent overthrows of governmental structures there have been, how heavily they're involved directly in the international trafficking trade. It's different.
I mean, it was amazing to see that map too, showing how interlinked it all is and how worldwide it really is too. But again, it was also hopeful to see, the different countries just grinding up the ivory and making efforts to stop it. Because that was one of my other questions initially when I first started watching was, these people just on the ground, working from the ground level to stop it, are truly risking their lives. And then my thought was there anything happening on that other end, and where's that meeting point? Are we close? Are we getting there? So I think, just again, it's just that idea of how interconnected and intertwined it all is.
You make a very good point, because people realize that unless you change the consumer side, which is something actually that China got very involved in for a while. There were big Chinese celebrities engaged in the Stopping a Bullet campaign, and the really powerful PR drive to change attitudes about poaching. And it at least for a while, it did make a difference. And there was a period of time where, China completely banned the sale of ivory. The situation has shifted a little bit, and it does change over time, but the international side of it is indeed very important, because as long as it's a commodity that has appeal for wealthy people in all parts of the world, it's going to be very hard to stop it. And not just ivory, other things as well.
Of course.
Animal parts, skins,
and the scales of
animals.
The
pangolin.
Yeah, that was just, I couldn't believe it. The thousands of these little creatures get shipped to everywhere. I mean, it just was unfathomable. But the center the rehabilitation center where they were trying to save the baby, and they brought it back to the mother so that the mother would know the baby had died. Are there, how many of those places are there where there are people doing that work? It seems like over here we hear about it, or they're, it's sensationalized, but we don't always learn about, well, why are they there? And it's just, how can people I guess I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here too, but because of, like you're saying, there's this, no one's traveling, so the ecotourism isn't there. Are there other ways that people can be helping? Like what are valid places that people can go to and support,
One thing people can volunteer. There usually are volunteer programs. So as Richard was saying, it can be very expensive. It is very expensive to travel in these areas in Africa. But if you go as a volunteer, expenses are, slashed, and they're minimal. And you can spend several weeks, a couple of months. Some people volunteer more than once and eventually come back and actually work in these places. But the ones that we show in Zambia were under the same umbrella. The ones in Zambia were involved with a group called Game Rangers International, and this fellow Sport, who's a kind of guide through the Zambia story, was the founder and the CEO of that group. And it's always a question of pulling in more support to underwrite things like education programs, volunteer programs, to enlist people like Prince William or industrialists in Zurich. There are always efforts being made to bring in well-funded supporters for different kinds of programs. And some programs in some countries are more successful than others. I don't know, I'm a little too inside of it, but Richard or Max, feel free to jump in, because I've lived this and obsessed about finding these for a long time. But
right.
I mean, our film obviously is looking at conservation and also sort of the giving people opportunity to profit from conservation in these local areas, rather than, turning in, as an alternative, a legitimate source of income rather than poaching, obviously. But it's just, there are so many areas where things need to be improved, and that's every step along the way that, we sort of were at the ground level there. So that's one aspect. That's where it all starts. But of course, from the other angle, you might think it starts from the demand. So demand has to be, and that's has to be dealt with, and that's through awareness campaigns, and then law enforcement to stop the transportation that needs to be stepped up. Corruption needs to be tackled. And then habitat protection just in and of itself, so that these areas aren't continually shrinking and shrinking. And, the animals that we think of, the lions, and in Asia, tigers, or, and we also see some cheetahs in our film, they need a lot of land to live. That's just how, evolutionarily. And so it doesn't take a lot before suddenly they're very, very scarce, because they just don't have enough land. So Mirra knows the specifics, but it's every aspect along the spectrum is just as important as the rest.
Well, right, because of how the ecosystem, right.
Yeah, we didn't even get into it so much, but habitat loss is as much a part of this problem as anything else. And it's sort of suggested when they talk about rural communities keep pressing up against these wild areas, which is why you have human-elephant conflict or human-lion conflict, all kinds of wildlife conflict. And that's just a population issue and a lack of variety of livelihoods issue, because people are constantly having to expand what kind of farm areas are available to them to take care of their families.
And I was just wondering, just touching back on what you were saying, Maxwell, is there still, how are the rangers able to keep the relationships they have with the different villages, healthy, and just to keep growing what you were talking about there, where, the conservation itself is protected, and that, those boundaries are able to be kept in balance between people and wildlife? Is that still, is that effort still happening? Is it, how does that get developed, really.
Well,
Mirra, you should take this. You go ahead and take this.
one of the ways is to do as much recruitment as possible from the villages. So you are a villager who is a village scout. And in that way, your interest and your allegiance is in both places. It's to the protection of wildlife and the environment, and it's also to your grandfather, as we saw in some of the footage, or your aunt or cousin, whoever. And again, it's really hard to generalize because it does vary from region to region and country to country. But I think there's a growing acknowledgement that the healthy future for these countries that have wildlife in Africa is a transition toward a much more blended relationship between what you might call wildlife law enforcement and wildlife protection, and that the connecting point is the community, so that the community is the beneficiary in both senses. Jobs in protecting, jobs in tourism, jobs in conservation, jobs in education. And of particular interest to me, it's a game changer for women. And in cultures where women have very little life choice freedom, and we saw this enormously in North Kenya, where things are much further along. It's a complete game changer for them. So
there's also a very fine line. There has to be a certain militarization, if you will, of the protective forces, yet it can go too far, and that's been clear with policing in America, but that's another thing. But it can go too far because there needs to be more, and that's why with women involved, the militarization gets changed somewhat, where people are helping the farmers rather than coming in with, militarizing enforcement. So because the cooperation, in the sense that it's critical that the farmers in particular, and these villages or farming communities, see the animals not as enemy or a source of needed protein, but that the animals are seen as a resource. And again, it's a very fine distinction between, if it becomes militarized, then there's a sort of a conflict attitude as opposed to a preservation attitude.
I'm not sure if that's exactly what your question is, but it is an issue where the two things in some sense have to become, they have to converge. The protection and the conservation have to be two faces of the same thing.
So is Kingsley's story kind of, is that a common story then? Is that seen often where a poacher is then brought on board to then come on to the other side? Or is that not, is that seen?
It happens. It's a little bit like the old adage that the best policeman is a guy who used to be a criminal.
Right.
So
interesting. I was like, I wonder about that.
One of the ways to bring people over, instead of, that's our little animal, to bring people over away from poaching, is to engage them with a livelihood. But it's also something that is mutable. If people aren't making enough money to make ends meet, if any number of other things happen, people do go back and forth. Wouldn't you say, Max?
I was going to say the exact same thing. I don't know how common it is, except that clearly it's not just Kingsley, because so Theo, who is one of the guys in charge of protecting the elephants, said in in some of our footage that didn't make it in the film, that there was at least one other staffer that he had who went back, and yeah, I did get the sense that they they would go back and forth, actually, that they would go back to poaching and then get caught again and then be given another chance. And I think that's great that they're given that chance, but it's not easy. Yeah, and it's because it's high risk, high reward. The payoff of selling at one ivory tusk or two ivory tusks, you know, is way higher than your weekly salary at one of these places.
Or your yearly salary.
Right.
And that's if you get paid. You know, when someone doesn't hold up their end of the financing bargain, people don't get paid, and then what are they to do? You know, it's I'm not saying it's not an excuse for poaching, but it's reality. You know, it's
which also gets back to the demand side. If the money is so high on the demand side, it becomes, I mean, that's the critical place that has to stop, because of the demand has got so much money, it's going to entice people that otherwise wouldn't do it. But it just, there's a point where, I mean, sport went through this, where they'll take the risk, and if the money, it can be very, very high on the demand side.
Yeah, the risk-reward ratio, or the fact that a pangolin is worth a year's salary to someone. It's a, you know, you can see how tough that is for people.
Choice. It's a very difficult choice, especially, you know, if your family, you know, they're like some of the farmers. The one family, the gentleman who's like, you know, we'll have tomatoes and onions, and, you know, my sons will have food. It's like, well, right, you know. But can you touch a little bit more on, because it is a hopeful point, of that community meeting, the scene with the community meeting. How is that also something that's commonly happening? Is it something that happens regularly, or is that not as common? Just so that these communities can be reliant on themselves. One of the women speaking was like, you know, she said it, and I had been thinking, she's like, you know, we need to come up with our own solutions. So is that happening? Is that taking place? Like, how, you know, how is that process going?
One of the things about the programs that seem to be the ones that are successful, and this one in Zambia is a new one. It's, you know, kind of fledgling. Again, in Kenya, they're much further along, is that the outside organization, or the in this case, game rangers, builds on something that already exists. So this is a meeting of the headmen. Ordinarily, the chief would have been there as well. And that's something that they would do regularly to discuss what the community needs and what its priorities are. And because the Nature Conservancy had identified this area as a place that really needed help, that had potential to organize itself, they got Patricia involved, the woman who says, I'm a native Zambian, I grew up in copper mining district, and I came back and I'm working for the Nature Conservancy. She became the liaison between an NGO and the community. And so the attempt was to build on what they legislate for themselves and what could be supported as a conservation venture that could yield revenue. And it took them several years to get to this point where it was conceivable that they could make the teak forest idea work. And again, in the parts of Africa that we've been in where these programs were successful, they completely absorb the DNA of how the tribal or the community structures work in order to bring the conservation idea through those structures. It's not rocket science, but it's really about the organization of human culture, and how people work.
And we just keep coming back to that theme of, there's that shift again of just understanding and educating and changing the thought process of how people think about our environment and how interlinked things are. And even in the film, so I think we can drop it. Even the film, you hear it where there's a gentleman speaking about unity, and it was just, well, yeah, that's what links us all in humanity, is we all want unity, I'm sorry, Maxwell, you were.
Well, I was just going to say, Mirra, maybe you want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned before that Kenya has a lot of programs that are much further along and have demonstrated, and that was the impetus for you going there for this film, I know, was to show how these programs could work. Because in Zambia, it's very much, at least when we were there, a hope and a prayer that something like this is going to work. In Kenya, they've demonstrated that it can. And then in Namibia, we also did that. So if you want to, I just think you might want to speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, well, it's a good point that you bring up. In Namibia, because of the way that Namibia became independent, which was not until 1995, and in their independence struggle, they were assisted primarily by Cuba, Russia, and China. So they have what is essentially a Marxist constitution. It's a sort of capitalist Marxist constitution. But one of the premier clauses of how their country is organized is that all of the wildlife, belongs to the people, and that this idea of conservation and the protection of wildlife is something everybody grows up with. And there's virtually, until very recently, there's been virtually no poaching. When it's come in from outside. And it's the idea of the community owning the wildlife is a constitutional given. That is very different from most post-colonial African countries where a patchwork of systems has grown up, and much of it based on private ownership, private game farms. People choose or don't choose to allow hunting, that sort of thing. In Kenya, hunting is outlawed. And particularly in an area in Kenya called the Masai Mara, there has been a long tradition of the communities owning their wildlife, and now it has spread to the north. And one of the people who's organized it in the north very successfully and done very well with it is a man named Ian Craig, who works with the Nature Conservancy. He works with Prince William and with the Tusk Trust, and they are one of the better financed groups that's doing this. But they, because of their ability to organize community conservancies where people really do well financially and in terms of the security of these conservancies as part of their income, they've been very successful. And it's something where each community makes the choice. They vote and they decide whether to organize themselves into a community conservancy or not. And if they do, they have this umbrella organization that will advocate for them, will help them remain organized, will help them with transparency and so on. But it's their choice.
So are the governments, I know it's a complicated governmental system with all of those different countries, but the ones that are in support of that, are there efforts to help surrounding communities? If one community is in support of like what you're talking about, is there outreach happening between the different governmental systems that might be working? Like you're saying, some are more well-funded than others. Are they interlinked at all in helping each other, or helping educate and make those shifts and changes?
Sometimes people will form regional alliances. In North Kenya, there's a lot of regional alliance, not just with something called Northern Rangelands Trust, but also with other large land areas where the owners of large properties will agree to take all their fences down, to be part of the same land use system that Northern Rangelands Trust, for instance, has instituted, and everyone seemingly benefits from it. And one reason why this was so successful was that actually there was real difficulty with poaching and with destruction of land in the north, to the extent that the Kenyan government pulled out of it and said, you guys up there, you deal with your own problems. And that was when this more, community-oriented idea was able to flourish. There was a precedent for it in the Masai Mara, where it had existed for 40 or 50 years, but it took on a different meaning in the North because of the way that it was organized. At the end of our film, you see something about linking all the green zones.
Right.
And that is ultimately what conservationists want. They want these zones to be zones that link across countries, not just within countries. Sorry, Max, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, because it's complicated because of the borders between countries, but the second level of complication laid on top of that is that there are distinct geographical regions where, you know, certain ecosystems can contain and support certain animals, and those animals evolutionarily need those kinds of trees or this kind of water system, and those things don't respect the borders that are just sort of artificially planted on top. So I think that's what's so special about the program that is specific to the Okavango Delta. How do we describe it? It's the water system that crosses the borders of 5 or 6 countries. That the animals, that's their country, you know? I mean, they don't respect the regular border. So
the Okavango Delta is the center of it, and it's where all the drainage from thousands of miles in Africa.
Right, the Zambezi River is the one that goes through. Yeah, so it's that whole river system, but it just adds another. But then one country like in Namibia might have 3 distinct climate zones that each have their own specific needs. Again, the more local you are, the better. So I think that goes back to our original idea of local ownership and management of these areas.
I think one of the things that Mirra discovered, or the film discovered, and Max discovered in this was the critical component of community, whether it's the village or the nation or the several nations together, but there's really a necessity for the sense of community health and community well-being, which obviously corruption just infects that, because it says, I can give you, one person, a tremendous benefit if you break that. And so there's that battle that's ongoing at every level, whether it's the poacher or higher up, between, am I going to serve the community and stay for community goodness or health, or for my own personal gain? And that struggle we came up against on so many levels. And when it fails, it's so disheartening. And when it succeeds, it's so thrilling, because it's very, very hard. And it's at every level in everything we I think came across in our work, in our travels, in our presence there.
And the hope was to let these people tell their own stories, so that people in this country or other countries could really hear it from them. So the people in our film are what Richard's saying, they're local people. They're the people who live there and have to make this choice every day. Am I going to continue on the protection side? Am I going to be able to send my little girls to school if I'm a wildlife police officer? What if I get killed? My sister died, I'm raising her child. These are daily choices that people have to make.
Right.
And we have to support them.
That was what I was going to say. It's like, for them to be able to make those decisions and, have integrity and keep in the forefront of their everyday actions, that their everyday actions are for the bigger picture and for the generations to come. It's, we all, in getting back to that theme of what the gentleman said in unity, we have to support each other from where we are locally in the best ways we can, right?
Yeah, totally. And also, in terms of, you raised a good point about what can people do. You don't even have to go and volunteer somewhere. Choose any organization, starting with the Bronx Zoo or, you know, your local Woods Hole, Boston
Right.
conservation group, and choose what you want to support, but do support something. And,
Right.
you know,
Because that is the point.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, helping people, yes. Because it interlinks with just everything. But I do want to let you know, I'm going to see if there's any questions here. I'm kind of kept an eye on it. I'm not sure if our host here on the tech side sees anything, because I don't on my end. But if there is anyone on that would like to ask our guests questions and I don't see it for some reason, please email us at support@woodsholefilmfestival.org, and I'd be happy to pass them on to our filmmakers and then respond for you, just because I'm not seeing it clearly here. I apologize. Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions come through, so that's why I kept the conversation going. But I just wanted to thank you so much. We are at our about 45-minute mark here. Were there any closing remarks you'd like to say about your film before we head off and our other directions?
Anything we wanted to say? Well, you know, first of all, I really want to thank the festival. It's, you know, a joy to be in a festival that's as respected and wonderful and identified with the things that we love. And we're very, very happy to be here. And I think the takeaway is, you know, get your friends and people you know to care about, you know, these issues that may seem far away, but they're not. You know, they're very close to home, really. And they matter. Beauty also matters. The beauty of the natural world matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that the film might do is, and you again, Mirra, you've been hinting at this, is might make someone more interested in what the state of their local environment is in terms of species going extinct and having habitat. And I know, so I during the course of making this, I think I went to a museum about New York State's conservation efforts, and then we had a really great success of with bringing the moose population back. So I don't know. To me, that was I felt a real connection to that, because it's I'm sure it's, you know, I'm sure everything is not hunky dory in that sense, but it's a lot better than it was. And so that was just a heartwarming thing. And I think if people can connect to the nature of their local environments, wherever that is, again, this is, I think films are narratives. And so that's how I engage with it, and that's how I can connect with it. And of course we can support people in Africa and through donations, but we can also support our local areas. And to me, it reinforced that connection to nature and my own curiosity about my own backyard. So.
Yeah. And it's a human rights issue. You know, everyone is entitled to an intact environment and to, you know, the protection of their surroundings. And we have to remember that's a right we all share. It's actually in the UN Charter that, you know, environmental rights are human rights, and I would just urge everyone to think about that and to help protect it for other people also.
I think we also discovered a certain spirituality in community, and that was unexpected and very powerful.
It is. It is. Thank you for saying that, and thank you so much for sharing this film with us. We're so happy to have you, and thank you for doing this Q&A and again sharing this narrative. It's an important story, and just thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.